Hi, my name is Chavika. I'm the coach for Elizabeth Moir. I'm going to be doing a debrief on the motion this house as the feminist movement supports the narrative that women should be selfish. So, first on proposition setup. The interests of the actor are fairly straightforward. The feminist movement wants women to have more agency, empowerment, and success. The characterization of what selfish is would probably entail pursuing your own interests, possibly careers, and giving that precedence over any other entities, especially like family. And I think it's necessary for proposition to point out that other attempts by the feminist movement of things like awareness and encouragement to enter the workforce has not worked because it's not a clear and strong enough message as selfishness would be. I think proposition can also frame that women who genuinely want to commit to caring for other people and engaging in traditional family roles can still do so because that is one, pursuing their own interests, and two, society anyway encourages that. Rather, this narrative targets women who are pressured into sacrificing for others despite wanting to engage in careers. So, this acts as a counterbalance to patriarchal narratives that ask women to sacrifice for others. I think it's also important for proposition to say that with this narrative comes a justification for being selfish, especially in the face of potential pushback to the narrative of being selfish. This justification would look like the feminist movement talking about the historical and systematic oppression that women have and are continuing to go through, the extent to which their freedom is restricted because they've been pressured to care for others, and the fact that men already act selfish and are allowed to do so. So, this narrative of women being selfish is simply an attempt to equalize. Arguments for proposition. Prop will probably talk about internalized sexism that women have, to say that women need to be aware that they are deserving of caring for themselves, whereas current narratives and status quo had coerced them into thinking they need to devote their entire lives to caring for others. So this acts as a counter to that internalized sexism. It also helps women deal with the pressure to sacrifice and also the internalized guilt after they take certain so-called selfish actions, because when there's a community of the feminist movement legitimizing you, when you see other women doing the same thing as you feel like it is okay, and therefore you won't hate yourself as much for taking actions in your own interest. I think proposition can also point out that women are anyway kind of criticized for being selfish when they try to be assertive in positions of leadership, when they try to voice out their own opinions. And now, when you legitimize being selfish from the feminist movement, and more women start to join the act of being so-called selfish, they are no longer a minority. So it becomes more normalized to assert yourself in leadership positions, to voice out your own opinions, and to do the same things that men would enjoy the privilege to do. You can also argue that this counters the narrative that romanticizes women's selflessness. For example, motherhood is celebrated as a virtue, but it's celebrated to the point where women are viewed as inherently and biologically selfless, and if they don't live up to that standard, then they are not a true woman and they get attacked for it. So, this keeps women from pursuing their own interests. So, the narrative of selfishness then legitimizes the idea of them following their own interests. It makes women and men more malleable to the idea that women can follow their own interests and they aren't held to a standard of being completely selfless. So the impacts of all these arguments are just that more women join the workforce, and also encouraging women to advance to the top of the industry and their workplaces is good, and you absolutely need to be selfish in order to do that because of general how competitive the market is, but also because of like sexist systematic barriers. And once women get to the top, that's a really good impact because of role models, because of the fact that when they're successful, they can make workplaces better for other women. There's also an argument for proposition to consider in terms of relationships. So they can say that women are currently pressured into thinking they have to, for example, put up with abuse for the sake of keeping the family together, or that they have to do all the housework by themselves without communicating their own desires or having time to themselves. So this narrative encourages them to think of themselves and to act in order to better their own situation. Uh, if I move on to opposition's case and talk about opposition setup, I think they can say that the feminist movement can still support things like awareness and empowering women to choose what they want and telling women that they deserve to be valued and deserve the chance to do what they want. And I think you can argue on opposition that these narratives are better than arguing to be selfish, because these narratives will get more traction. The narrative of being selfish is something that can go against conventional cultural and religious beliefs, and even though proposition may get the feminists to advocate for being selfish, in order for it to get more advocacy from institutions like schools or people in power or celebrities, the message has to be a little bit more palatable. Another thing that opposition can do is to push proposition on their stance, to question to what extent is proposition pressuring women to join the workforce, or are they simply okay with a level of selfishness where they just do whatever that they desire. You can argue that in order for proposition to claim the benefits or the impacts that they want of getting more women to the workforce, you need a really strong message that really encourages women to join the workforce and not buy into traditional ideas of caring for others and families. So this can then ostracize women that genuinely want to, say, engage with traditional roles of caring for families, and it can make them ashamed of then not being a woman as the feminist movement dictates. They can also be criticized for the feminist movement for being subservient to men, even though that is actually their real choice. Necessary framing or characterization for this level of argumentation to work, I think, is to say that the feminist movement is not monolithic. It's not a singular organization. It's made up of millions and millions of different individuals, and you can't control all of their actions. So even if they are all generally supporting the narrative to be selfish, some may be more extreme and others than enforcing it. So that may lead to them shaming or criticizing women that don't subscribe to the narrative. And this can deal with proposition's push that they take a very supportive approach when enforcing the narrative. Arguments for opposition, they can say that misogynists would manipulate the narrative of being selfish and use it as rhetoric to say that women only care about themselves, that men are doing all the breadwinning for the family. And the important thing here is that misogynists will say misogynistic things anyway, but uniquely here, the feminist movement is themselves are advocating for selfishness, so which is something that generally has a lot of negative connotations with it. So this gives moderates a reason to doubt feminists and to trend towards sexism. And the harms of this are that it hurts support for policies from moderates to help women balance their work life and the lives that care for other people, like their family life. For example, maternity leave or the ability to breastfeed in workplaces. It can also just lead to more sexist interactions when people hate women or think they are just not good people. And these sorts of sexist interactions can just happen in public life. It can happen in online spaces where they become far more toxic towards women. It can also be that it is now harder to call out men for being actually and truly selfish when women are apparently doing the same, or at least the feminist movement is legitimizing the narrative of them being selfish. You can also argue in opposition that this worsens the discourse around certain issues. For example, the right to have abortions, when it can be spun as a narrative of being selfish, which implies something negative about caring only about yourself. You can spin that into saying that, oh, they're killing babies simply because they don't care about anything else other than their own self-interest. So when you add that element of selfishness, it takes away from the actual suffering that requires women to have that freedom to make those choices. Then another thing that opposition can say is about the harm that occurs to other women from women when they try to pursue their own interests. For instance, in situations where females feel like they can only win by competing with other women, this could be because of internalized sexism. They think they can't compete with other men, or it could just be the reality where there are just very few women who have opportunities because of systematic sexism, or it can even be in workplaces that are generally trying to be diverse but have quotas for the amount of women that they'll take. Then women would feel like the only way that they can succeed is by putting down other women and making themselves look better. This is bad because it creates a toxic culture in workplaces, but also because you lose out on potential solidarity between women. And also, when you focus on getting yourself to the top no matter what, you may then lose out on women speaking out on structural issues in the environment and in the workplace that are hurting all women. Opposition can also say that even if women aren't being toxic to other women alone, the push to be selfish can make women act overly selfish to the point where it can be used as a reason to fire them or not give them promotions, and justified by saying, oh, they're not a team player. And once that stereotype is created, it can apply to women that don't even buy into this narrative of being selfish or don't do any actions that could be construed as selfish. And that's harmful in and of itself, but that harm is particularly bad when it comes to careers where you genuinely have to prioritize other people as opposed to being selfish. For example, when you want to be a leader or a politician, if women are being viewed as selfish, they're probably going to be viewed as incapable of doing those types of jobs, and therefore you'll get less women in positions of power, and the impacts of that are pretty obvious. You can also argue in opposition that this hurts collective action, because you need the feminist movement to have solidarity, because that's the only way you galvanize enough support to change systematic issues. You can't do that when the selfish narrative makes you prioritize your own work, put down other women, and think those issues that affect other women are irrelevant to you. Opposition can also say that even if women don't attack each other, they can still be collectively selfish as a movement. That means they could be encouraged to attack or at least be less considerate to other vulnerable groups' needs, particularly when those other vulnerable groups' needs come into conflict, or at least claim to come into conflict with women's interests. For example, trans women's rights are being claimed or portrayed to be conflicting with women's rights when it comes to sports or women's only spaces. So then, if women are pushed to being selfish, they may then be encouraged to not be allies with other vulnerable groups, but rather to attack them in order to fulfill the interests that are better for women as in general. Another argument that opposition can run is they can talk about underprivileged women. So women from minority ethnicities, lower socioeconomic classes, working single mothers, they cannot afford to have things like daycare for their kids. They can't afford to have caretakers for elderly parents. So when this narrative comes about, not only are the dependents harmed if they subscribe to this narrative, but the women will feel ashamed for not following that narrative, or feeling guilt at their inadequacy, that they're not being a proper woman and not following what the feminist movement tells them, when they have no other choice but to care for these people. So that's probably the arguments that opposition wants to run. In terms of clashes, there'll probably be a big clash on who gives women more choice and empowerment. Op will assert that proposition is forcing women into the workforce and shaming those that don't want to be there, whereas Prop can say the message at its core is still about women doing what they want regardless of what other people want them to do. They can also say that the choice to not enter the workforce is something that is colored by internalized sexism, and that is countered by the narrative of selfishness only in proposition's world, and therefore proposition is fulfilling choice better through the narrative. If proposition choose to take a harder stance to say they really want to encourage women to join the workforce at the expense of caring for other interests, proposition can then justify that trade-off by saying women being encouraged to pursue careers even at the cost of their choice to do otherwise can be better for the individual, because it gives them financial independence and social connections through careers, which is useful for having a stable life and also not being stuck in abusive relationships. But also collectively it is better for women because it changes stereotypes about women in the workforce. It gets more women in positions of power and gives them the capital to advocate for empowerment and make workplaces more friendly towards women. So at the end, both the individual and the collective get more capacity to make free choices. Op will then argue that the advocacy and the empowerment is hurt because of a lack of moderate support when misogynists use this narrative as rhetoric, and also because the selfishness of women will hurt the solidarity that is necessary for collective action, and therefore it will not translate into advocacy for women's choice and empowerment, and that will hurt women's choice. Another clash can be just on the perception of women. So Op will argue that people will view women unfavorably because the narrative is about being selfish and that has negative connotations, and that will be used as rhetoric against women. Prop can contest this by talking about how the necessity to be selfish will come about through this narrative, and it will create awareness on the injustice that women are going through and justify them being selfish. Prop can also argue that even if the perception is currently worse, it will get better eventually as more women join the workforce and succeed and are understood to be people who are capable of being succeeding. Those are the potential arguments, setup, and clashes that can happen in this debate. There are probably a lot more. Thank you for listening.